From mere appearance, she looks Indo-Guyanese, but she's not. A mother of four and a career English teacher, Rondha-Ann Lam wants to be President of Guyana, and she's doing so on the platform of the Citizen Initiative, a group of mostly young Guyanese passionate about the development of Guyana and eager to break race-based voting in this country. She has already faced the mudslinging that comes with politics, and she has already been forced to quit her job. She spoke with Newsroom's Insider about her decisions. So, thank you very much for talking with us.
Thank you for having me.
What are you doing?
Officially, I am the presidential candidate for the Citizenship Initiative, which is a newly launched political party. Initially, we had no intentions of contesting the 2020 elections. However, we've looked at a number of factors in the last couple of months that has moved us from just citizen awareness and pushing for voter participation more in politics to testing the waters to see how viable a third party remains in balancing this kind of adversarial politics that we've practiced for a long time.
Tell me how it all started.
Earl Johnson and I have been friends for over 20 years. We have chatted, we've gone to battles over things political, things historical. He's had his opinions, I've had mine. And so what we were looking at, through the course of our friendship and also our friendship with other people, was a group of young people who were A1, they were professionals in their fields, and we were looking to see how best we could harness those resources into something that was viable and could not only inspire all Guyanese, but more specifically younger Guyanese, in wanting to be civic and practice, civil politics. So conversations led from that into, well, how are we doing this? And so we developed a 6-pillar approach to what we consider to be good political governance, and it's just blossomed from there. Persons have come on board, they've joined, they've indicated a willingness to participate, even if it's just at policy levels. So that ultimately is how it started and how it's reached to this point.
But initially you didn't have any background in politics. Were you interested at all?
My initiation into politics is brand new, meaning that at no point in my life did I ever imagine that I would be, contesting the elections as a candidate. I've always participated in, discussions with my friends. I've read things political, kept up with political theory and concepts because I teach literature, and literary theory crisscrosses at major points with political thought. And so that kind of knowledge about politics and things like that have always been there, but participating, no.
But you voted?
Oh, I voted when local government elections, when I was old enough to vote, I absolutely did. And then more recently, I've been encouraging my children, showing them at the various levels at which, you can vote. And so local government elections are just as important for me as regional and national elections.
But you voted in regional and national before?
Absolutely.
Who did you vote for?
I've actually switched between the Leviathans. When the first time I voted for the PVPC. We were young, just out of school.
Which elections was that?
That would be 1997. I'm that old. And so, we were at that dawn of democracy call and that kind of thing. Both of my grandparents actually were split between the two. And I don't remember battles about it. I just remember that's not making any sense what you're telling me. And, and so they kept at that. But they always encouraged me to look at things like the manifestos, look at who could be, kind of trusted and, would be competent enough. And so when the AFC arrived on the scene in 2006, by that point I was just tired of the fighting. And I said, all right, let me give my vote to the AFC. And that was my pattern every time they went to elections after that. When we went to the coalition, I thought, great, this might be a good opportunity for, this inclusive governance we're talking about, trying to stop the fighting. And so my vote, because of AFC, went naturally to the coalition. Since then, I am not saying that there have not been positive things, but we have moved past, these promises. And now we want more action, and we're ready and willing to take the steps to getting those actions.
How do you see the Citizen Initiative being different then from the other political parties?
One of the things that I think is our strength is the fact that we have quite a large number of young persons involved. And ultimately, that is a driving factor in T.C.I. Now, that can be used against us, and they can say that we don't have political experience, but I don't see where that political experience has gained us a lot of positives. What we have seen is from the older, and when I say older, I don't mean age, I mean more experienced politicians, is the lack of will to push for, massive groundbreaking changes. And so T.C.I. differs from a lot of political parties in that we're not only youth driven, but we are looking at the best practices that work for everyone and not just, aligned via a party, which is what we have seen quite a few parties take a hard line on.
What sort of groundbreaking changes do you envisage?
We are looking for constitutional change. It is not something that is brand new to conversations in politics. In fact, the APNU had that as one of their pillars in the 2011 election. They had it in the 2015 APNU AFC manifesto. One of the things we've seen with it, though, it seems to be a conversation opposition parties have. They talk about constitutional reform, and then when they actually get into government, it's a whole different ballgame.
What sort of reform are you thinking of?
There are quite a few that we're looking at. One of the first ones, of course, is that the powers that are ascribed to that executive presidency. The head of state is not only head of state, but is also head of government. And so it ascribes these broad reaching powers, that, and it literally has no checks and balances on it. And that is difficult, because one of the things you're hoping for every time you put a president into power is that, that power will be used for good. And so it's a kind of a hope and a prayer all at the same time, that this person has the best interest at heart. Adding to that as well is if you happen to get someone up there who has, tendencies to be corrupt, there are no checks and balances in terms of punishment. And when I say punishment, I mean just, the ability to investigate and prosecute such a person, as an example. That same rule is not applied to the ordinary man on the street, though. And so there is that great disparity between the two. The 1980 Constitution also spoke about, how MPs are sent into Parliament, and there is a large disconnect for us between the person who's representing you in Parliament and your actual constituency. Many times persons don't know who that is. That person has never lived in the community. They don't go back to it. And so what you have is someone who's representing you who isn't even aware of what your issues are. And then at the same time too, that person is loyal to a party list. And that loyalty to a party list we saw play out in the no confidence motion. MPs are expected to toe the line. So the fact that Charandas Prasad could say, I had a conscience vote, and that made people jump, because we don't do that in Guyana. And so it created, whilst it worked for the people of Region 6 who he was representing, he finally got around to the system. The rest of the population was like, no, traitor, he was bought out, and we want to change that kind of mentality. Your responsibility as an MP shouldn't be to a party line or to a government. It should be to the constituency and the people you represent. And there's of course, biggest one is inclusive governance and shared governance. It's a word that two phrases that gets tossed around, and not a lot of people understand it. And so the idea is that if you include the opposition in your government, they're anathema to your concepts and your ideals, and so it could never work. But then you also have, as a result of that winner take it all attitude, is a large swath of the population who feel alienated from the corridors of power. They look at the government, they don't look like them, they don't practice policies that impact them, and so they feel very alienated, and that is horrible, especially if the voting is pretty close. And so that winner take all needs to be revised. It has been included in recommendations to the last constitutional steering committee's recommendations. And so what we're proposing instead is a kind of a allocation to the opposition, whomever they may be, in terms of their electoral strength. So which could range from anywhere from 3 to 6 ministries. It doesn't necessarily have to be the hard hitters, finance, resources, but something to include them. and it's based on their numbers. So it could start at 3 and it could go to a maximum of 6. But then the executive still retains the hard hitters, finance, natural resources, security sectors, those kinds of things. But what it does, I feel it would do for the people, is kind of give them a momentary pause. Because they're, the people who look like them, the people who represent their interests, the people who have similar political inclinations are also in power and are also working towards fixing this quagmire we seem to find ourselves in every election time we have.
Talk to me about your family heritage.
Which side? Mom or dad?
Both.
I can trace my heritage on my paternal side, my father's side, far further back than I can with my mother's side. My great-great-grandfather was immigrant 1102 on the MV Sevilla. His name was Lamapu, and that is the reason why not all Lams are related to each other, because they all have different, endings at the end of Lams. He was a weaver, 26 years old, a Manchu Chinese, and he came to Guyana. And then from there, he would go on to marry. We have Scottish heritage as well. His son would later marry a Scottish woman of Scottish descent in Guyana. And then, from there, the generations have intermixed and intermingled, and here I am. On my mom's side, I don't know much about it. I can only trace up to 2 generations past my grandparents, and they're just names. But because I was raised by the paternal side of my of my family, I know more about, and that history was concretized. So we can trace all the way back from that arrival on that first boat to all the way down to everybody's the youngest relative at this point. And one of the interesting things about being the way I look is that depending on the country I'm in, I could move from being Venezuelan to Spanish. In the US, people speak Spanish to me. One time someone said, and they're speaking in Hindi, and I know that because I've watched tons of Indian movies, and the mistake I made was responding to what they said, and they're rattling off, and I'm like, listen, I'm Guyanese. What? Guyanese don't, So I'm not actually, I do not have, that I'm aware of, any kind of Indian heritage in me. In fact, on my mother's side, I am Amerindian, black and white, and on my father's side, I'm Chinese, black and white. So this face and how I look is not Indian. But then I was married to an Indian man, and so my children are literally, ethnically, fully Guyanese. The last thing I was missing, they were able to get from him. And so, to answer your question, my loyalties do not lie to a political party. They do not lie, well, now they do, but before. My loyalties lie to where Guyana's interests are. And I think if more people were like that, then they would understand it. As for being a mom, I have 4 children. Their future is sacrosanct. I want them to be able to stay here and to grow, to be able to access education. I want them to be able to access jobs that match that education and experience. And so I also am pushing for more women to step up into political roles, and not only political roles, but just in society. We've had situations where we've had to literally legislate gender participation in politics. And so we want to move away from that 1/3, legislated women on the list kind of thing. And I've said to my students for years, I'm training the politicians. And they would come back and they say, Miss, it's rough out there. That system is not pleasant. And one day I said to a student, I said, I can't believe I'm training you for, to become our leaders. And the child turned to me, it was a girl, and she turned around, she said, Miss, but all this talking you're doing, why are you not in the system? And I laughed. But looking back, this trajectory was kind of set for me. My grandfather used to introduce me as his little politician. I'd have an opinion on everything. And one of the things he trained me for, he says, it's great to have an opinion, but it's also great to have a measured opinion. And one of the easiest ways to have a measured opinion is to educate yourself and then ultimately take part in the process. So I think 40 years later, I've stepped into that role, sort of, yes.
You're a teacher.
I am.
But you've also explained to me how entering politics has affected that role, at least your present job. Tell me about that.
One of the things about being in certain positions, whilst there is no legal encumbrances to participating in politics, there is kind of that unspoken word, that you're not going to be very political in here. We cannot have you. I mean, even though you're not going to campaign and you're not going to, openly try to persuade your students, I think there are the moral and ethical considerations to take into place. And so one of those great disappointments is that our politics has not matured to a point where persons can actually step out, be political, win, lose, or draw, and then, not necessarily step back, but that they're not seen as wanting to corrupt or wanting to influence other persons. And I understand the rationale behind it. There are certain fields where you just have to be apolitical. And there comes a time when like in my case, I can no longer be apolitical. And so I have had to weigh this step I'm taking into the fact that I can't allow my employers to suffer, even though technically we've moved way past that and there's free speech and all of that. I would rather not have them face any kind of criticism that comes from my actions or lack thereof. And so my job, I've had to give that up in terms of moving forward. This doesn't mean I'm out of the teaching field. It just means that as an active classroom teacher right now, that is going into elections and moving into this field, I can't remain in that field.
Do you expect to suffer, for want of a better word, other negative consequences as a result of joining politics?
One of the only things that has concerned me in politics is not so much the mudslinging, but it is the...
The mudslinging will come.
Oh, I've experienced a taste of it. I was the feature speaker at our launch. And what I found was I could handle the comments under the videos of the speech and things like that. That was fine. That's par for the course. But it was this where persons created profiles to literally jump into my Facebook inbox and, my social media and things like that to make these comments to me. Now, in a 21-year teaching career, I have handled from irate parents to, distraught students. And one of the things I've always practiced was that I'm willing to listen to criticism. What I'm not willing to listen to is criticism that comes with expletives, criticisms that come with comments about who I look like.
What are you dealing with Roel Johnson?
Roel...
Expletives is
Roel has his own style and manner in getting points across.
Do you have to manage him then?
Yes. He's probably not going to be very happy with me saying that. But there's been many a time where I've said to Roel, you could do less with the competitive measures, but Roel has the ability to express himself, and he has the intelligence to move otherwise. But I'm not talking about that kind of thing. I'm talking about the people who jump into my inbox and call me a traitor, and the people who jump into my inbox to tell me on any given day...
They call you a traitor, what do you suppose?
I'm a traitor, I guess, because I'm...
Because you look Indian and they think you should be PPP.
And then those persons who know where my previous loyalties lay, it's like, oh, you just want the oil, don't you? And that, I think, has hurt more than anything else. There is this idea that, all of these people want their hands on the oil. And I am always at the point where after oil, what? When this oil has been used up, and utilized, what is our game plan? How are we holding these politicians accountable? So other than that, I don't see, you could say whatever you want about me. I think for the most part, I've managed to, and bear in mind, campaign has not heated up yet, but I think I've managed to cope with it. 21 years has given me some experience in handling conflict, and as well as handling, people from all walks of life and coming to some resolutions that have thankfully allowed me to remain in the system for 21 years.
How do you see the role as presidential candidate?
I know I'm supposed to say the obvious, which is, servant leadership, and wanting the best for my country. I envision this role as a bigger thing. And what do I mean by that? I mean that I see myself as part of a movement pushing our people towards greater civic activity.
What does that mean?
We are people in a culture where we literally go to the voting booth, we put our X, they're the people sometimes who look like us, sometimes who share our political views, and then we go home and we cross our fingers and we hope that who we've put our X for wins. We do nothing in between that period. Now we complain on social media a lot, but we don't do anything major to hold our politicians to, accountable. And then 5 years later, we start the cycle all over again. What we would like to see, and what I would like to push for as presidential candidate, is persons who are aware of the issues. They've been paying attention to, both sides of the coin, and that they're willing to even possibly, and this is the one that people are afraid of, changing their vote to not because the person looks like you or they're pushing your policies only, but that there are other options where, that collective we steps up. So in terms of seeing my role as the presidential candidate, I am not looking at March 2020. I am looking at what I can do between now and March 2020 to move our population into more civic awareness, more push for them to study the issues that affect them, or even listen to people who can explain the issues that affect them. And they can make informed choices at the ballot box.
Politics is an expensive thing. Where are you getting your funding from?
We've answered this question many times. The initial launch and all of the things that we needed to do to this point has been self-funded. We've literally dug into our pockets and handed over from members. I'll give you the interesting example of the day after and it was actually a newsroom article that popped up on an old family friend's feed on Facebook. And he messaged me on Facebook and he says, I have a little something for you on Monday. You could use it to print some pamphlets and things like that. And he sent it with his daughter. And when it got there, and I opened the envelope, I was shocked. So I messaged him and I said I received it. I said I was not expecting that amount. And he says, it's okay, you're a good girl. But it has been persons like that. What we've talked about, even launch night, was electoral campaign reform. Where people are getting their money from and how responsible. What we're looking at is not allowing persons to be able to influence us, after elections, should we get into the parliament and ultimately government. So financing so far has been out of our own members' pockets, and there have been well-wishers. We have kept a careful record of those persons. They understand that any money they give us, we are responsible for how it's spent, and that they're not to expect any favors from us. We have infrastructure in place that would cater for persons who give out certain amounts and documents they'll have to sign, stating that, this is not going to be used against us in the future when it comes in fact the term they use is lobbying. And so we've looked at all of those things. But to answer your question, yes, we are self-financed and well-wishers.
So where do you get a core team of people to push this thing together? I know you've talked about having young people and discussing issues and so on, but in terms of getting a proper team in place?
We have an executive body in place. They are, they're the core drivers in terms of recruitment. For instance, I'm responsible for our education policy, and what I have done is not only gone out into the community and spoken to, teachers, but I have many friends who are teachers. And so our policy is not being driven by concepts as much as it is being driven by people on the ground and the experiences. So when you see we launch the manifesto, it's an amalgamation of a number of persons who've contributed, either their time, their talents, and ultimately what we do is we've gone into communities, we've taken these core tenets that we have, and we're saying to them, this is what we think could work. Tell us, how do you see it? Some people have said to us, that won't work here. And what we've discovered across the length and breadth of Guyana is that what works for Linden doesn't necessarily work for Essequibo. And so those persons have also driven our, they've come on board from that kind of participation, but they've also contributed not necessarily in that team that you're talking about, but in a wider cross-section of Guyanese contributing to actual policy that will affect them.
I'm interested in your vision for Guyana and its development. Talk to me about that.
My vision is pretty broad-based. The launch night, in the feature address, I looked at Guyana being not only a world leader, mighty but very powerful. Small but very powerful. But also, I am looking at turning out world-class, education policies for our University of Guyana, for the teachers in the system, for our children. We're looking at how we can push STEAM more classrooms. We're looking at digitized classrooms. We're also looking at diversification of, the various crops we have in Guyana. We're looking at infrastructure for the future, moving the capital city inland to cater for climate change. We're looking at how we can do the orange economy. And when we say, diversification, not only necessarily in crops, but moving towards fields that aren't traditionally earners for Guyanese. So the Guyana I envision has good governance. Each citizen feels like they're being represented by the political power. It offers world-class education systems, financial systems, as well as our ability to attract investors and also to keep those investors in terms of following our rules. Yet at the same time, they feel those rules are feasible enough for us to be able to make a profit from it. One of the things that people talk about all the time is the bureaucracy and just setting up and doing business in Guyana, and that creates that kind of slithering in under the table. And so it's easy to throw money to get it done, but it also stifles young entrepreneurs. It also stifles young persons with not that kind of dollars from just trying to do business in Guyana. So it's wide-ranging for me, starting with a revolutionized cultural tourism, from regenerating policies that years ago could work, still work here, and so on and on. Our vision moves from the tiniest of things that you would think minuscule all the way up to great things for Guyana.
So tell me what you would do with oil revenues.
There are two thoughts for me when it comes to oil revenues. The first one, of course, is dealing with the immediate consumption needs, which is the fact that we have vulnerable members of society, the elderly, single parents. We're dealing with teen pregnancies. There are quite a few things that need fixing right away. And so I would, well, not me personally, but T.C.I, it is our policy that we're looking at targeted cash transfers for especially vulnerable sections of the population. We're also looking at universal education back all the way up to tertiary, and it doesn't necessarily mean only the University of Guyana. And then, of course, we have to keep, and this is paramount, because we have to pay back our debts to international donors. And then, of course, we have to manage to keep that oil GDP aspect in check with the non-oil GDP aspect, those sectors. Because one of the dangers with that, and the term running around is Dutch disease, one of the dangers with it is inflation. And if we ramp up spending to the point where we're unable to control it and people expect this money at all times, then we're going to run into problems. So for me, it's twofold. Immediate consumption that's going to be able, to alleviate some of the ills we suffer, and then long term in terms of how we can transfer that into education for our population, how we can look at diversifying the other aspects of and shoring up those ailing sectors to move them, and then to move into industries that we've not really paid much attention to, which is things like the arts and copyright legislation and things, all of that would focus another aspect of the GDP. And for me also, it is after oil, what then? We are expected to jump by 86% in GDP. We're a small nation, and we're all indications a corrupt nation. So that is a lot of money that some of it has to go into creating systems for governance.
So how do you root out corruption?
We're going to have to start enforcing the current rules we have on the books. People believe that, this is Wild Wild West and there are no rules. There are rules. We have to get officials into actually declaring assets. We have to get persons who are suspected and, there's been an investigation and there's been proof of underhand dealings. They're going to have to suffer the consequences of the law. So one of the first steps towards is actually enforcing laws we have on the books. And they exist. What we have is a tendency to shift around. We duck an investigation here or there. We put an official, move them from one location to the other one. And that is not going to work. And then, of course, once you start enforcing the rules and there's stiff penalties for breaking, the laws of Guyana, you can now move into more sustainable practices where everyone, the opportunity to steal a little bit of the people's money is not that, it doesn't look that robust or rosy for the person.
Ray, do you think that this citizen initiative will work?
Like I said earlier, persons believe that we're hunting for positions in government. We are not. What we are looking for is a push to have the citizenry involved and helping to make decisions and shaping policies.
Well, like you said, it has been a 5-year cycle of going to the polls and
correct.
End of story.
Yes.
How do you make that shift? How do you convince people to make that shift?
One of the first ways of getting people to walk the talk is actually doing it yourself and showing them how it's possible. We have heard so many things about T.C.I. We have money launderers in the mix. We have deep state, Mercury financing us and things like that. T.C.I. has walked the walk and talked the talk. We have stepped into the ring. We have allowed ourselves to be targeted, for lack of a better word. And we're showing persons that, these are not 30 and 40-year-old experienced politicians. We're not, they didn't start in the PPPC or the PNC, but they're ordinary citizens. So it can be done. And we're showing people how it can be done.
Your family think you're crazy for doing this?
My siblings do, I think. My children are, my oldest boy, I think he's more older to recognize certain things. So he's using words on me like conflicts of interest. How are you going to deal with that, Mom? The girls are thrilled because I have said to them, one day my oldest girl said, I'm going to be president. And I turned to her and I said, I know. So I think the older ones are more, not the older ones, but the siblings and, my aunts and uncles, they are concerned more about the mudslinging and all of the comments that will be made. But I think it's par for the course. It's kind of expected. Anyone joining this field should expect it.
I've heard this story that of your siblings, you're the only one here.
I have a younger brother here, but he says you have my vote, sis. He is not.
At least you have one.
Right. I'm at 2 votes at this point. My oldest and younger siblings live overseas, and I think they think I'm nuts.
But you can also go, or you could have had that opportunity.
I've had multiple opportunities to do it. One of my oldest siblings once said to me, I have no idea why you'd want to stay in that backwater. Because this is how we're viewed. And I said to her, so if we all leave, who is changing this backwater? So opportunities have presented themselves for migration multiple times. It's still sitting there waiting. I've just never been interested.
So why do you think you can change it?
Do I think I can change it? I think it's an uphill battle. But my grandmother once said to me, you talk a good game. Let's see you walk the game now. And one of the things she's always pushed me for is to walk the talk. She says it just takes one. And that one will find another one, and then that one will influence another one, and then suddenly you have 10 people. And that's exactly how it worked out in T.C.I. And then each one of those 10 will now influence 10 more, and suddenly you have 100. So it's that first step. And once you make that step, then the next step comes, and suddenly you find change.
Great, thank you very much.
Welcome.